One of the oldest and most fundamental fantasies of an RPG is to slay a dragon or a great beast and use its scales or hide to forge weapons and armor, to directly turn your enemy's defeat into power for yourself. Monster Hunter is a game that has understood this well. From its inception, Monster Hunter was a series inspired by the older RPGs of its time, so for it to adopt this idea as its main reward system was logical and brilliant. It's a design that has easily stood the test of time. There's not a single game in the whole series where you do not slay monsters, carve their parts from their bodies, and then create new equipment to become stronger. It perfectly captures that classic fantasy within its main gameplay loop. However, there are some games that have deviated from this and created new vectors for rewarding the player that thematically and mechanically break away from the classic fantasy the series was built on. Today I'd like to look at these deviations and analyze their effect on the gameplay loop and general vibe of the games. If you've been following me for a while, you may be familiar with a video I did about grinding in Monster Hunter. That video already touched on a few of the things we're going to talk about here, but was focused more on a broader look at how grinding has changed throughout the series. So in this video we'll be taking a deeper dive on a few things I glossed over previously that I think are worth talking about in light of recent developments. For a significant part of its early history, the reward system of the series was defined purely by the parts you get from monsters and the equipment you craft from them. Your only motivation to fight and craft was your desire to become stronger and to expand your collection. This experience was bolstered by a number of long-term goals you could chase after if you chose. You can look at the Eternal Dragon Slayer in Monster Hunter 1 or the armor upgrading system in Monster Hunter 2 for examples of this. But every game had their own selection of equipment that you could sink very large amounts of time into to obtain or max out. But it ultimately all boiled down to slaying a monster and getting the parts you need. The texture of the experience was very simple but satisfying. You could directly chart your path toward obtaining the equipment you wanted. Look at the list, make a note of the things you need, look at where they come from, and then set out on some hunts. You will steadily and in an easily trackable way make progress toward that goal. In time, though, the games began to offer alternate gearing methods that supplemented, or in some cases even superseded, the main system of obtaining equipment. The first we would see of this was the artifact system in 4 Ultimate, where you could go on quests, obtain artifact pieces, and then polish them to obtain gear with random stats. This was a predominantly endgame system that could potentially offer very powerful gear if you were lucky or dedicated enough to interact with the system. This was the first disconnect between fighting a monster and crafting equipment. In this system, you could obtain equipment not particularly tied to any monster you fought, that could be better than the equipment you crafted from monster parts. Additionally, by 4th gen, the requirements to craft gear had comparatively gone down, with gear usually only needing 1 gem or mantle, and the effective drop rates of these types of items having gone up from how they used to be. So long-term equipment crafting had been reduced somewhat, while this new system could provide a longer-term goal. 5th gen would see the rapid expansion and proliferation of these types of systems, with multitudes of systems designed to reward you with additional monster parts and new non-monster related items that let you create gear like tickets. The floodgates were opened to allow you to acquire gear beyond just the normal slaying of monsters gameplay loop. World also introduced probably the most significant departure from the classic reward system, with what can only be described as weapon gacha. In 2 cases, Kolv-Tarath and Safi-Jiva, the system of obtaining weapons from these monsters was turned into one where you fed the rewards you got into menus, and it would spit out a random assortment of weapons with varying element types and stats. In the case of Safi-Jiva, you could also upgrade them with an additional randomized system where you would roll increased stats on them. At this point, the classic fantasy of slaying monsters to create equipment had broken down entirely. I mentioned earlier the texture of the experience in the old system. The gacha system has all the texture of simple gambling. No longer is there a chartable path to obtaining what you want. There is no trackable progress. You just roll the dice until you get the reward. There is a small consolation in this that these 2 monsters do not make up the majority of the endgame content. While their weapons are good, you can easily skip over them if you don't want to interact with those systems, and you're not missing out on that much. The game still does have a lot of normal endgame content in it. Monster Hunter Rise had no gacha systems, but it did have the curio crafting. which I would consider to be adjacent. In this system, at the very end of Sunbreak's content, you could essentially spend the endgame monster parts to reroll new abilities and stats on your equipment. You of course still had to make all the gear the normal way first, so in some ways it's more related to the augment systems that have been common since 4 Ultimate. It is still a sign of a trend though, that being offloading the grind of the game from the normal monster part farm and into the randomized dice roll systems. Very notably, Rise was extremely generous with drop rates and crafting requirements. Crafting the equipment you wanted was easier than ever in most cases. There were also no long-term chase items, as had become pretty standard since the start of 5th gen. If you wanted a long-term grind for equipment, the curio crafting was your only option. And now we come to Wilds. Wilds has brought with it almost inarguably the easiest equipment grind in the series, with investigations offering the possibility of guaranteed gem drops, and general crafting requirements being the lowest they've ever been. It also has 2 endgame pillars, both of which are completely disconnected from the classic monster slaying fantasy. The first is the Hunter ticket system. These are tickets dropped not by certain monsters, but by the rank of the monster instead. These are needed to craft essentially all equipment at the endgame, and you will spend often more time trying to get these than the other monster parts that you need. The other part of the endgame is the Artian weapon system. In this system, slaying monsters will get you Artian parts that you can then feed into a menu, and it'll spit out a completely random weapon. Yes, another gacha system. This time though, it is the main endgame system of Wilds, and it has only gotten more emphasized as the title updates have come out. With Gogmazios now being available, you can take his parts and further augment your Artian weapons with more randomized stats. Notably, Gogmazios does not have his normal weapons in the game. The upgraded Artian weapons simply take on their appearance. A classic fan-favorite final boss monster added in a title update does not actually have all of his real equipment in the game. They used him as a gacha farm skin. It's notable to point out that Gogmazios is the final title update of Wilds, meaning the Gogmazios gacha grind is the only thing left to actually grind until the expansion comes out. It is the final farewell of the base game content. Wilds is not a game that emphasizes the fantasy of slaying monsters to create their equipment from the parts you get from them. You are meant to spend your time collecting tickets and gacha currency. Taking into consideration the greater context of Wilds' ease of accessibility, with its railroaded story, hand-holding tutorials, somewhat weak monsters, and easy combat laying the history of these reward systems out makes the trend pretty clear. The intention has always been to make obtaining monster equipment easier, while concentrating the actual grind into these supplementary systems as the replacement for long-term chase goals. I feel it's worth speaking for a moment on the ethics of gambling. Of course, it has to be stated that this is just a video game, and the weapon gacha system does not have any real-world monetization attached to them. However, even simulated gambling is an intentional form of psychological manipulation. These are systems designed to get you hooked and keep you rolling for that perfect weapon drop over and over again. In the context of a live service game where player attention can be correlated to microtransaction sales, I do believe you could draw a line between the motivation of adding these gacha systems and making sales on in-game purchases. Now, I think it would be fair to say that Monster Hunter has always been based on randomness. The drops you get from monsters are random. You have to grind for the drops you want. So, are these modern systems really any different? I do think the form they take is the largest difference. In the classic system, as mentioned before, there is a sense of trackable progress. You can also see where each thing you want drops from, and in some cases you have control over your own odds. That drop you want might have a higher chance if you cut the tail and break the head. There's a clear agency in getting what you want. Ultimately, Monster Hunter has always been a Skinner box. It is the fundamental essence of the series, but previously they did more to obscure it and make it feel natural, for lack of a better term. The gacha mechanics simply drop all pretense and lay it bare, that you are truly just a rat in a cage. I'm of course presenting these things as problems with the design of the game. However, it's very likely many don't mind these modern designs. They've added mechanics of this nature in several games now, so it can be assumed that many people don't mind them, or at least no one cares enough to be loud about their dislike of it online, such as myself. So I think it would be unfair to say that this is something that needs to be fixed by just removing the offending mechanics or reversing course in the series. Not to mention how that just isn't very likely to happen anyway. I think there could be a compromise or a coexistence between the old and the new. The crux of the issue as I've laid it out is that if you're a fan of the classic monster slaying and equipment crafting reward style, your gameplay has actually been diminished in favor of pushing you into these newer systems. I don't think this needs to happen. I think you could absolutely have the gacha mechanics and complex reward systems alongside a more classic-styled base reward system that requires real grinding of monster parts to make the equipment you want, with some long-term chase items thrown in as well. I think this is a rare case where you really can just make everyone happy. The only drawback you could see here is that the overall amount of grind in the game would go up, because not only would the RNG systems be present as a long-term grind, but also just crafting basic gear would also go back to being a major grind. If you wanted to do both, your task ahead of you would be truly gargantuan. But honestly, that's sort of the spirit I think Monhan needs to tap back into in some ways. If you look at the older games, the grind needed to obtain the best gear was quite intense. If you saw someone with silver Rathalos armor in DOS, or the Eternal Dragon Slayer in Monhan 1, you knew those guys really put in the work. In this way, these grinds also serve a social function. It's cool to show off the stuff you put a lot of time and effort into, and it's cool to see other people's stuff that they're showing off. As a 20-plus-year-old series, it's natural that Monster Hunter has changed much over that time. Sometimes for the better, others for the worse. In terms of rewards, I think the series has struggled to find an identity that stays true to its roots, while adapting to modern sensibilities and tastes. I would be curious to hear your own thoughts on this topic. How do you feel about the reward systems of Monhan in the old games versus new? Do you think there's a place for the classic fantasy and grinds? Are gacha mechanics the way of the future? Let me know in the comments. Thanks as always for watching. See ya.